everyone, and thank you for joining us at tonight's Planning Commission meeting. I'll ask everyone to please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. All right, ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, thank you, everyone. Could we have a roll call, please?
Chair Baldino.
Here.
Vice Chair Newman.
Present.
Commissioner Kildoff.
Here.
Commissioner Magai.
Here.
And Commissioner Heschler.
I'm here.
Okay, thank you. Now it's time for public communications. This is an opportunity for the members of the public to address the Planning Commission on anything not already on the agenda. Do you have anyone on Zoom wishing to make public comment? Please signify by raising your Zoom hand. All right, seeing no one in chambers, we'll close public communications. Next agenda item, written communications. Do we have any written communications, Eduardo, besides what was in our agenda packet?
No, besides what was in the agenda packet and the PowerPoint presentation that we sent to you, I believe yesterday, there's no other written communication. And just for disclosure, what we sent to the commission yesterday via email on the PowerPoint, that has also been posted to the city's website for the public's viewing pleasure.
All right, thank you. Next item on the agenda is consent calendar. On the calendar, we have a request for a larger than 8-foot tall sign at Topgolf, approval of the Assembly bill to have meetings per Zoom, and approval of Planning Commissioner meeting minutes. Does anyone want to pull any of the items on the consent calendar? All right, then I'll take a motion for approval. Motion by Heschler.
Second.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you. Okay, next item, continued business, none. New public hearings, none, which brings us to agenda item I, new business. We're going to have a presentation, our annual housing element progress report. And Eduardo, who's going to make this report for us?
That's going to be our principal planner, Paul Samaras. While he kind of gets set up, what I wanted to do real quickly, if I may, Chair, you may see a new face here. Her name is Jasmine Farias. She is our new addition to the planning division. She comes to us from a very far place, about 100 feet from us. She was with our building division. She's a graduate of Cal State LA, and she's worked in the private sector in HR capacities and some other capacities in the private sector. Came to us a couple years ago and has been helping our building division as a permit tech, and recently with our opening in planning. We did after we did send out a recruitment process, interviewed many applicants, and we landed on Ms. Farias here, and she'll be our new planning tech moving forward. So you'll be seeing her quite often at these meetings. So with that, I'd just like to present her, and I don't know if she's got a word or two to say.
Welcome, Jasmine.
Thank you. I'm very grateful for this opportunity, and I look forward to serving the community in a different way and working with you all.
Great.
Welcome,
happy to
Jasmine.
have you.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Chair.
Sure. All right, Paul, you have our report for us?
Sure, yes. I
you.
don't have a visual presentation other than what was given to you in your packets tonight. I'll just do a quick summary of what was in our short report. Good evening, Chair Baldino and fellow commissioners. Every year, the state of California requires cities to submit a report on residential permit activity to gauge how well cities are doing in meeting their REDA goals. Your packet has our 2021 report, which we'll be sending to HCD in the next few days. Just a quick summary, our department had permitted 15 residential units last year, including 9 ADUs, 3 single-family residences, and 1 3-unit multifamily project. This is lower than previous years, probably explained by the pandemic and downturn in building activity. We also report on entitled projects, so the state can gauge what's coming down the pipeline as well. In 2021, we entitled 1 project, a mixed-use project in the downtown at the corner of Richmond and Franklin. You saw that downtown design review in the summer, this last summer, and it included 4 residential units. On a related note, the entitled projects number will likely increase substantially next year, because as you may have heard, the council voted to adopt the Pacific Coast Commons project very recently. And if they adopt the accompanying ordinance in April, then we may very well be looking at construction in the next year. So that concludes our report on the item.
Okay, and Paul, how often are we reporting on our housing element? Is it a yearly?
It is yearly. Once a year, we have to submit this report by April 1st.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Paul? All right, well, thank you, Paul. All right, next item is a presentation and a study session regarding preparation of an affordable housing strategy with our consultant, Many Mansions.
Good evening, Commissioners.
Hello.
Let me share my screen. How are you?
Good.
So,
All right.
yeah, so while he's sharing his screen, that is Alex Ross from
Russell.
Russell, sorry, Alex. He's with Many Mansions. They've been retained by the city to help us through developing an affordable housing strategy, which is kind of what is before you tonight, is more of a study session item to gauge from the commission and also get some input from the public in terms of a strategy. What should include, how else can we, or what can we do to effectuate the goals and policies of affordable housing that's called out in our housing element. So anyhow, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Alex, and he'll give you a presentation, which again was sent to the commission and posted online, that PowerPoint presentation that I noted earlier.
All right. Thanks, Eduardo. Good evening, Commissioners. As Eduardo said, my name is Alexander Russell. I'm the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at Many Mansions. We have a pretty big agenda because we're covering a huge topic, but please feel free to stop and ask questions as we go. This is meant to be a discussion about the housing needs here in the community. So just a little bit of background. The city sent out an RFQ for an affordable housing services provider back in 2020. We entered into an agreement with the city almost a little over a year ago. We entered a professional services agreement in the fall, and we've been working since that time with the team on reviewing the housing element, the Pacific Coast Commons Development Agreement, and kind of participating in various pro-housing strategies. But the main crux of what we were brought on to do is help with an affordable housing strategic plan. That's a cohesive plan that incorporates all the various elements identified in the housing element. So just a little bit about Many Mansions, just because I think this will help shape the discussion. We are a nonprofit. We're a nonprofit affordable housing and services provider. So we're a little different than the typical consultant. We actually build affordable housing. We own and manage affordable housing here in Southern California, and we provide on-site services for our residents as well. We've been around for over 43 years. We have 70 plus staff members and an all volunteer board. As mentioned, we currently own and manage about 538 apartments here in Southern California, helping over 1,400 low, very low, and extremely low income households. We're one of the leaders in Southern California in supportive housing. That's housing for people that are homeless, disabled, people with special needs. We have a strong pipeline now with several hundred units in development. We provide, like I said, free life enriching services for our residents. And I think that's something that's important when you're looking at affordable housing, about what it is and what it isn't. And we are also Developer of the Year for Southern California Association of Nonprofit Housing in 2020. So a little bit of the framework. As you all know, sixth housing element is upon us. The city has a fairly substantive goal of creating 521 units. 207 of those units are supposed to be for housing and households that are very low income, 99 units for lower income households, and 84 units for moderate income households. So that's quite a significant number of units that need to be created, especially given the city's history in creating affordable housing, which we'll talk about more later. There are consequences to not meeting housing element or arena goals. I won't go into that too much because you've already seen that, but there's just a listing there. So what is affordable housing? You know, there's a lot of misconceptions. That's a pretty broad term. You know, affordable housing, what does that mean? Technically, it's just deed restricted housing, you know, for moderate income, low income, or very low income households. I've put some of the AMIs, the area median income levels for a household of 4 here in LA County. Obviously, it's higher here in El Segundo, but I think people are often surprised what it means to be low income in our community. It's a relative term. And so every community is a little different. So you could be a household of 4 making almost $95,000 a year and be considered lower income. It also includes housing for many of our essential workers. I think during this pandemic, we all realized how important housing is for our hospital workers, our people who work in retail, our people who work in restaurants and keep our day-to-day lives moving forward. Residents typically pay about 30% of their monthly household income for rent and utilities. So when people do live in affordable housing, they do pay rent. It's just lower based on their ability to pay. I think people are often surprised that applicants undergo a more vigorous qualification process than typical market rate housing. There's usually background checks, criminal history checks, things of that nature, which are more substantive than market rate housing. And many mansions, as your affordable housing consultant, that's something that we will help ensure that as affordable housing is built here in the community, that those requirements are met. It's often built by nonprofits or civically minded for-profits. And the design, quality, and amenities actually meet or typically exceed market rate developments. People are often surprised that the green standards, as far as water efficiency, energy efficiency, are often much more substantive based on the funding that's used to build affordable housing. The handicap accessibility requirements are more stringent. The community space is usually more robust. And so often that housing actually has better amenities than most market rate developments. And one of the things that I think is key to providing successful housing is on-site services. It's something that's typically provided for free, especially when done by a nonprofit. And that's free after school homework tutoring programs, summer camp, backpacks when you go to school, life skills training, job skills training for the adults, things that really improve the quality of people's lives. Instead of just giving someone a home, you give them an opportunity. And I think that's something that's important to keep in mind when you think of the term affordable housing. People are often surprised what affordable housing looks like. People have misconceptions about the old public housing that was done in major cities like New York and Chicago and others, where it's high-rise, housing that is poorly maintained and has, different activities going on there. But that's really not the way that housing is done now. Typically, most affordable housing is not done through government entities. It's done in public-private partnerships where communities and the state and federal government provide resources for nonprofits and, like I said, civically minded for-profits to build the housing that they'll own and maintain. And so these are just a few examples of housing that Many Mansions has done recently in various communities. You can see that it has lower density, is well maintained. The aesthetic quality varies. The finishes are high end. The quality is well done, and there are on-site amenities for the residents. Like I said, oftentimes affordable housing communities that we build and our peers build are often some of the nicest communities in that neighborhood, some of which have not had as much reinvestment in a while. So why do we need more affordable housing? There's, as was mentioned in a previous city council meeting and in the various reports I've read, there's been no apartments built here in the city in the past 40 years. And that's a tremendous amount of time. There's also 0 affordable housing units per government code. Park Vista doesn't meet that strict definition, even though it is a wonderful development and is doing a great community benefit. Naturally occurring affordable housing, that's housing that tends to be affordable just on its own, often becomes dilapidated, overcrowded, or lost to market forces when a new buyer comes in, renovates it, and increases the rent. some people might be surprised to know that 40% of the residents in El Segundo are moderate income, and 25% of the residents that live here now are lower income. 7.8% or 1,300 residents here are living in poverty. That's a much deeper affordability level that's set by the federal government. Again, another 1,300 or so are disabled, and there are at least 50 of our residents who are currently homeless. The median sales price is quite high, as you know, which is wonderful if you're a homeowner. But as you're trying to break into the market, you go up here, you want to buy a house, you want to stay here, you want to retire here. That can be a challenge, especially with a single-family home costing about $1.5 million at the moment. And you can see the max affordable purchase price for someone typically who is lower income, they can only afford about $350,000, and that won't really buy you much, if anything, here in the city. Some of the benefits of affordable housing, as mentioned, allows lower income persons who grew up here, who want to retire here, who have kids here, who want their kids to stay in, to be able to stay in the community that they love. And so, having enough housing is important from that regards. It improves educational outcomes for low income adults and children, reduces incarceration and recidivism, improves health outcomes. There's been a lot of talk in the industry about housing as healthcare. If you don't have adequate housing, you're in overcrowded situations. Oftentimes you're not getting access to the healthcare, having money for healthcare, or all of those types of things. Permanent supportive housing for people that are homeless actually reduces the cost to public safety programs, police and fire. A lot of resources go towards caring for people that don't have a lot of options in our emergency rooms and other situations. It actually boosts the local economy via construction jobs, employment at the communities, ongoing jobs that are consumer driven. When people actually have an affordable place to stay, they typically spend more money in the community because they actually have some more disposable income. And it also provides an opportunity for employers to attract and retain employees and remain competitive in the global economy. So there's been a lot of housing related community outreach so far. I won't read through all of it, but the staff and consultants have done a wonderful job working with you to reach out to the community and get their feedback. There was a great survey that was done that had pretty strong participation. I won't, again, go through all that because you've seen it, but I just want you to know that we did look at it when we came up with the recommendations that we'll talk about later. And I think it, again, informs the discussion about where housing should be, what type of housing should be built, and who should be served. And the business community, a very important component of El Segundo, is obviously looking at affordable housing needs as well. The El Segundo Economic Development Corporation is working on their own analysis, but they talked a lot about housing and how important it is to their companies and to a thriving economy here in the city. And again, I can go back to any of this. There's a lot of information, so I figured I just wouldn't read it. There's also a tremendous amount going on here, and Paul will talk a little bit more about this, but there are several things that staff and consultants are currently working on. So I'll turn it over to Paul, who will quickly kind of go through all the different things that are currently underway. Paul?
I was going to briefly mention a couple of code amendment efforts that are ongoing to the commission. The staff has been working with another consultant to develop some informational material on those topics, and we do intend to bring those items before the Planning Commission in the next few months. Briefly, for those unfamiliar with state density bonus law, it is a law that incentivizes development of affordable housing. For example, developers that incorporate a minimum of 5% very low or 10% low income units in their otherwise market rate project can utilize the state density bonus law to build additional market rate units above the maximum density permitted in a zone. In addition, They can get exceptions to standards such as parking, setbacks, or other concessions such as approving mixed-use zoning and other similar concessions. Again, the intent when we bring this item before you here is simply to incorporate what is already in the state law, but make it part of our municipal code. It's not really to deviate or go above and beyond, just a matter of, you know, amending our zoning code to include a density bonus law sort of section, so people are aware of what those rules are. The same applies to the Transitional and Supportive Housing Code Amendment that we're working on. State law requires that these types of uses be permitted in all residential areas and be treated the same way as other uses that are permitted by right. The micro-unit code amendment is not a state mandate, but it is a commitment made in our previous housing element and that carried over to the recently adopted 2021-2029 housing element. Basically, micro-units are residential units roughly between 150 and 400 square feet that typically share some common amenities such as kitchens or laundry facilities. They are also called single-room occupancy units or dormitory-style units. They are typically permitted near transit facilities, and they are a different housing type that can help meet the housing needs of different groups, different population groups. We'll be happy to answer any questions you have about these code amendments and hear your thoughts or suggestions on these as well. Also, we'll be happy to put together a fact sheet on each of these topics and share it with you before we come back to you with any ordinances or recommended code changes. With that, I will hand things back off to Alex.
Well, before we do that, Paul,
Sure.
so has City Council given instruction to move forward with all of these options? Or are they exploring it still?
This effort is part of the SB2 grant that was, that the city was awarded. And the City Council did approve that sort of grant application and the scope that came with it. So these three code amendments, where we were authorized to pursue these by City Council.
Okay, so that's program 8. What about program 1, 3, and 4, and 5?
These particular programs are primarily carryovers from our previous housing element that are just ongoing. And to answer your question more directly, they are part of the housing element that was recently adopted. So
Right, the element sent to the state, but a lot of those things were proposals that we were told had yet to be approved by City Council. So have they given direction on these, or are we still at this kind of research and figuring out phase of all of this?
okay, well, these are programs that were indeed authorized by the City Council, just by the fact that they had adopted the housing element, and they had approved these previously under the older housing element. I hope that helps clarify for you.
Somewhat. For the density bonuses, I get that we are obligated to amend our codes to comply with state laws.
Mm-hmm.
On those larger projects that are using the density bonus, will those come, is that like an over-the-counter issue, like an ADU, where we don't even see it? Or will those come before us to where we at least get to look at the project and have some say?
Those will come through the regular discretionary entitlement application process. It's just that they will also carry that additional application for the density bonus incentives.
Okay, thank you.
Great. And you'll see here, as we go through this, we wanted to highlight what was in the housing element, talk about some of the things that were applicable, and then later set the stage to augment a few of those things. I think similarly to what Paul was stating is a lot of what we're trying to do here is not reinvent the wheel, but to effectuate and augment things that have already been approved, and then obviously have a discussion about some things that we may want to explore further. So again, I won't go through each line item. I highlighted kind of in green some of the areas that would probably kind of roll over potentially into the affordable housing strategic plan. As you saw, there was a couple rehab programs that had been suspended. The housing element talked about maybe reinstating those, as we'll talk about later. That's probably a good idea, especially given the aging housing stock here in the community, as a way to kind of keep housing for some of the lower income residents. There's already been a decent amount of discussion at the city about SB 9. So again, I won't go into too much detail with that, but the proposal that's currently being explored obviously has an option for including affordable units when there is a kind of a lot split and new units are built. And so that's kind of why that will make it into the final plan, because there is an opportunity to create more affordable housing through that ordinance.
But I understand that's not an option, right? If you split lots by SB 9, you're required to have affordable housing. Isn't that what we landed on there?
It's not for the state, but I believe that's the
Yeah.
ordinance that the city is working on.
No,
Correct me if I'm wrong, Paul.
No, that is correct. The SB 9 ordinance does require that one of them
Mandate.
needs to be deed restricted.
Okay, thank you.
Inclusionary housing ordinance, that's something that was that offers some opportunities to build more affordable housing. In this one, I'll talk about some of these items later. That there are things that other jurisdictions are using to encourage affordable housing. Again, I won't talk about too much here, but these things that are underlined, I thought, and were identified in the housing element, are things that we think probably warrant further discussion. And we'll talk a little bit more later about why continue to explore housing or an inclusionary housing ordinance is warranted. The second part of the program 4 was basically to create the Affordable Housing Strategic Plan, which is part of what we're the main gist of what we're talking about tonight, is to get community feedback, come up with a set of ideas that we want to pursue. But again, the Affordable Housing Strategic Plan, I should mention, is just like any strategic plan. It's a planning guidance document on things that want to be explored further. It isn't necessarily going to be a detailed document that has the implementation of how all of these policies will come into place. I think that's going to be a much longer process, similar to these other programs that will come back to you for further consideration and the council. Providing adequate sites, as you know, the city is going to have to rezone the sites for the 29 unit RENA shortfall from the last housing element by next October, amend the municipal code accordingly, and then start working on rezoning the larger portion of sites to meet the regional housing needs assessment shortfall. We'll talk a little bit more about the downtown specific plan, some opportunities there. And you can see all of these sites. This is just a summary of what will need to happen to those sites. Basically, if it's along PCH, there'll be kind of the mixed use overlay. If they're in other parts of the city, they'll be the RENA O overlay, and there's kind of 30 units an acre or 40 to 50 units an acre, depending on the site. Lot consolidation, really that's part of the site inventory. A lot of the lots are small here in the community, and so lot consolidation is critical with regards to finding opportunities where the projects are big enough to be feasible. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Paul already kind of talked about the El Segundo Amendments. I believe to answer that question further was, while these efforts have been approved by council, the actual language is still being worked on by the consultant. So I don't know, it's not fully in place, but the concept to move them forward has been approved. So this is really kind of that was all really background. This part kind of sets up where we're at and where we're going. The housing element is really well done. It's actually one of the best housing elements that we've read. It's a great start, a lot of great programs, but when we're looking at it, it's not enough to actually produce sufficient units to meet the RENA goals. Looking at the site inventory as a builder, that's what I do with most of my day, is I'm looking at the sites, and really, besides Pacific Coast Commons, which was approved, those are the highlighted items down at the bottom there, the 5 sites. There's really only 3 sites that will allow enough density for a feasible affordable housing development. Typically, you know, when you look at affordable housing and the financing we use, there's a lot of pressure from the state to reduce costs. There's a lot of incentives to build larger, more efficient projects. And from economies of scale perspective, you really need, you know, at least 30, but really 50 plus total units. So we're not really talking about density, you're talking about total units for feasibility of an affordable housing project. So again, when you're looking at the site's inventory, you see the church site, which could allow 113 units. You see the site on Sycamore Avenue, which will allow 34, and then the 2 sites there in 6, also on Sycamore and on PCH, you can theoretically build up to 82 units. Those are the sites where you could have a feasible project, but that doesn't really get you to your housing element goals. As you saw, it was over 200 units of very low income and almost 100 units of low income units that still need to be potentially built. It should also be mentioned that the rezone sites are assuming 20% of the units will be low income in order to get the by right approval process per the new municipal code zones. And so the reason I bring that up is for the next slide, which is a case study that kind of shows how future developments might play out here in the community. So we look at Pacific Coast Commons, which is obviously just recently approved last week by the City Council. Great development. Like I said, we were involved in a small extent in the affordable unit negotiations. But this is the first apartment project built that's going to be built. And I put 30 plus years, but obviously really more close to 40 years. But as a builder, it's risky and costly to go through the process they did. You need a specific plan. It needed a general plan amendment, a zone change, a zone text amendment, et cetera. They had to spend hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars to get to the point where Planning Commission and City Council could even consider their development. It's large. At 263 units, there's probably not going to be that many opportunities to build something of that size and scale in the community, and that's twice as large as any of the rezoning sites. It's also pretty dense. At 90 units an acre or so, that's much more dense than the 30 to 50 units an acre for the rezoning sites. It's also fairly tall, not in every part, obviously, but in parts of the development, it's up to 6 stories, and versus the normal 32 feet and 2 stories that are currently allowed in all the residential zones. And this site, given all those factors, the size, the density, the height, the consultants came to the conclusion that really 10% of the units were the feasible level. The developer went up to 12, which was amazing, and I credit the staff for those negotiations. But again, looking at it, only 32 units will be created, and considering the 300 or so lower income units that need to be created over the next years, that's a small percentage. Again, 20% of the units for these other rezone sites will need to be low income for by right approval. So that's a much higher bar. Should also be mentioned that only 1% of the units, or 3 total, are going to be very low income. And that's where the city has their largest and most challenging road ahead. Very low income units are very difficult to build by market forces. And so that's something that I'll talk about in the conclusion. Like I said, 204 units of very low income units are still left, and 70 low income units are still left after Pacific Coast Commons is built. So the conclusion that we came to is it's very unlikely that market rate developers will be able to meet the city's RENA goals, especially the very low income units. So more must be done if the city wants to achieve these goals and avoid future penalties. And so I think that was a good framework for the larger discussion. So these are just some options to encourage affordable housing. Obviously, we want to hear more input later on in this discussion, but it's always nice to have some sort of basis for that discussion. So we threw in a few things that we've seen in other jurisdictions that have been tried and true that we think could possibly work well in this community. Again, the city doesn't have to adopt any of these. These are all optional recommendations. As mentioned, housing stock's fairly aging, so reinstating the minor home repair program for low-income residents is probably a good idea. You know, the Affordable Housing Fund has $5.3 million in it currently. A portion of that could go to reinvigorate that program. One of the things that we also think is important is a lot of jurisdictions will put a 55-year window on the affordability period. Now, it sounds like a long time, but eventually those 55 years come, and then you lose those units to market. So we recommend as you if you create new policies, that you put in a language that those affordable units be restricted in perpetuity. Doesn't really cost the developer anything. They don't particularly love it, but it's something that I think is beneficial for the community, because I have seen several jurisdictions that used to restrict units as 30 years, and they're losing many more affordable units than they're creating right now. You might, again, want to explore restructuring Park Vista to obtain RENA credit. The way it's structured now, and I'm not saying change the levels or have anyone be relocated or anything like that, but you could restructure that project potentially to get some RENA credit to meet the current legal definitions for affordable housing.
Can you explain what that means? What do you mean by restructure?
Basically put in a development agreement that would have restrictions on who lives there, what levels the AMIs are, how you would qualify, and basically have a deed restricted property that meets the current requirements for RENA. So again, not trying to relocate anyone, or if you did it, you could obviously do it through attrition as people moved out. You know, no one wants to relocate anyone, but it's just something that warrants further exploration. And mainly the reason for that recommendation is it's so difficult to create new units. If you can actually get credit for the units you have, that's always beneficial. Housing element 2, mainly just effectuate the municipal code amendments. This program, again, there's a middle income housing program at the state level right now. We're actually working with some for-profit developers and government agencies on similar programs where they come in and buy properties that are currently market rate, deed restrict them. So some of the units are low income, some of the units are moderate income. They do get a property tax exemption for doing so. The city would get RENA credit for the low income units. And again, no one's relocated. Those units are deed restricted for 30 years. At the end of it, the city would actually get to own the property. So I think it's something that you might want to encourage if builders know that that's something that would be supported. You know, they're more likely to look for opportunities here in the community. So it's a good program. It's worth looking into. Explore the use of enhanced infrastructure financing districts. It's a mouthful. Basically, it's kind of like, for those of you who are familiar with the old redevelopment agencies and how that worked, these are kind of more localized districts within the city where some of that increment financing, property tax increment financing through investment goes back to the city to be contributed to the Affordable Housing Fund. Definitely takes work and effort to do that. So it's basically just a recommendation to explore if that's something the city would want to do. Similarly, the next item, explore a state pro-housing designation. There is basically at the state level, you can apply to be pro-housing. Sacramento is the only jurisdiction that's done it so far. The reason that's good is the city and projects that are competing within that are located within the city are more competitive for state housing funding. So there are some things you'd have to do. I can go into that in a little bit more detail, or we can talk about that later. But basically, it's a lot of the policies that we're talking about are things that would help in that regards. And if there's something that the council is interested in exploring, we can go into it in more depth. Explore mechanisms that enable consistent contributions to the city's affordable housing fund. That could be things like commercial linkage fees, and other, in lieu fees for new developments. Things that other jurisdictions, other cities are doing. So that's basically just an idea to explore what it would take to implement here in El Segundo. One of the questions that staff asked was, how should the Affordable Housing Fund be used? You have $5.3 million from the Imperial site. We basically think, providing assistance to nonprofit developers if they have a site that could be a good affordable housing site. We think that's the best bang for your buck because you get to create the most affordable units, and that nonprofit or for-profit can leverage that money usually 2, 3, 4 to 1, usually closer to 4 to 1 with state and federal resources. And so it's a way that it stretches those dollars. Land banking would be if the city wanted to, hey, there's this site that we think would be great. The city could buy it using that funding and then do an RFP or figure out a way to encourage someone to build affordable housing on that site. A lot of jurisdictions used to do that with former redevelopment funds, and other jurisdictions do that with their housing funding. You could also pay developers market rate developers or just homeowners to restrict more units. Like the city in theory could have said, hey, Pacific Coast Commons developer will give you $1 million. This is just an extemporaneous example. We'll give you $1 million if you include 10 more affordable units, right? That could be a way to utilize that funding. Or, hey, we want all the units on your new development, including the lot split, not just the additional ADU, but all your units restricted, or something to that. Someone's building 6 units and they don't really have an inclusionary requirement. You could encourage them to basically buy down some restricted units or maintain units if ever those units expire. You can further explore the Inclusionary Housing Ordinance. And again, one of the reasons, while we know that the council has kind of delayed that for further exploration, one of the reasons we kept it on here is, as mentioned, it'll be difficult for purely affordable housing developments, or a majority of affordable housing developments to be built based on the site inventory. So the kind of best opportunity to create more units would be when other builders are building and they include some units as affordable. Now, the ordinance doesn't necessarily have to be an ordinance. It could be a guidance document that kind of says these are things we're typically looking for, and then the city could still negotiate on a deal-by-deal basis. Obviously, Pacific Coast Commons has kind of set the bar for negotiations from at least a starting point, but this is something that we think warrants further exploration. We were talking about rezoning the sites. We know this is a long shot, but if for some reason that Civic Center property ever became available or other city-owned property became available, that's something that's a lot of jurisdictions are doing because of the Surplus Land Act. We're working in several communities where the city had surplus land or bought and donated land. That really reduces the risk profile of affordable housing and really gives the builder the time that it takes to get the project approved, to get the community input, to secure the 4, 5, 6 different funding sources that it takes to build those units. Explore a religious institution overlay. As we mentioned, the site that had the most development opportunity was a church site. Pasadena and some other jurisdictions are looking at religious institution overlays, mainly because a lot of faith-based organizations really have a passion for helping those in need in the community, and many have surplus land that they're not utilizing as much for a variety of reasons. So it could be an opportunity to kind of build some more housing and provide some more resources to the faith community. A general affordable housing overlay is something that some jurisdictions have done, where again, it kind of relaxes density, height, parking, setbacks, and other standards for projects that are primarily affordable housing. It could be 100%, could be some lower percentage based on the community's desire. But certainty is something that is really at the crux of development, as you who are in the development industry know. And so having that kind of overlay reduces the risk profile, encourages more building. Explore a scattered site development standard in addition to the lot consolidation. What I mean by that is for non-contiguous parcels, one of the largest programs that are used, the tax credit program, allows projects that are within a mile to be non-contiguous and have a common financing management structure. And what that does is, in a community like this that's mainly built out, if you can have one approval process or kind of this scattered site development that has some concession on, community space and parking and things of that nature on one site, it looks at the whole development or looks as all sites as a whole, that could encourage some additional development. This one is something that some jurisdictions are doing where they allow residential development in their commercial zones. I put in the RENA MU-0 zone as kind of a baseline, but basically, in a lot of communities, commercial centers are not thriving the way they used to. And I'm not talking, just because people are working from home and all those things. And so kind of encouraging residential mixed use in all commercial zones. It is being encouraged in many under the new housing element rezoning, but it's not universal. And then encouraging more residential in the downtown specific plan. As you know, having developments, housing in those communities that are walkable reduces traffic, increases consumerism, helps attract younger professionals who are looking for that work-life balance. So it's something to further consider as you're doing the downtown specific plan, which I know is in process. This last one is, again, something that doesn't cost developers anything. It'd be as you put new ordinances in place or work on your development agreements. I believe this ended up in the Pacific Coast Commons development agreement, is putting a live-work preference. You can't by right say someone has to live in El Segundo to qualify for this housing, but you can put in equal preference for live or work so that residents of El Segundo have the first shot when affordable housing units come online.
Wait, can you back up and explain that? I've been told
Sure.
It's against federal law for us to say that affordable housing goes to El Segundo residents first. And that sounds exact opposite of what you just said.
No, what they said is true. There's a nuance to it, which is, you can't say El Segundo residents. It has to be an equal preference to live or work. If it's both of those things and it's an equal preference, not a one than the other, then from my understanding, we've done this in other communities, meets the spirit of the fair housing law. But you can't by right just say you have to live in El Segundo to live here. You have to have both of those components.
So you can either live here or you can work here, and that will get you to the front of the line for affordable housing?
Correct.
Do we have anything like that in our books? Is that in the development agreement with Pacific Commons?
I recommended it, and I believe it is.
Can we confirm that? Because, it might be too late, but that's a huge one that we've talked about over and over and over again, and we've been instructed you just can't do that, right? That's what people want. They want their kids to live in El Segundo. People who grow up here want a right to live here. And now I'm finding out for the first time that we can do that, so.
And it is a preference. So there's a period, let's just say, that you can say in perpetuity where the unit just sits vacant.
Oh, sure.
But you have to put in a reasonable time frame, 30 days, 60 days. And then if there's no one from El Segundo who lives or works here and he meets all the other standards, then it would go to someone else outside the city or who doesn't work here.
No, that makes total sense. I would really appreciate if people who live to work here had first crack at affordable housing. That just seems like a common sense thing we can do for folks who already live here or work here and want to live here.
Absolutely, and that's why we suggested it. It's something that's common in every city. I've never worked in a city where that's not been desired. Housing Lot 4, So this came up from the early input for the housing element. I know there's a company that does 3D printing here. Explore streamlining of factory-built permitting process. And what I mean by that is like the city of LA, they have kind of pre-approved floor plans for factory-built units that basically kind of help speed up the approval process if they use that that pre-approved floor plan. Because you may or may not know, in factory-built housing, the city actually, the state takes on a large oversight role on those units, and it bifurcates what the city can approve and what the state approves. And so there is a way to kind of streamline that process. Offer streamlined processing and permits for applicants for affordable housing. There is some discussion about streamlining the review process for smaller projects, 10 units or less. We would recommend that that be augmented to include, again, projects that are 100% affordable housing or have some degree of affordable housing that the city desires, mainly just because, again, that certainty, that time, that cost is essential to encouraging more development. Waive or defer development fees for affordable housing. That was in the housing element and something some jurisdictions have done. Obviously, development impact fees can be quite high and add to the cost. And so certain jurisdictions, certain cities will reduce or waive those development impact fees to encourage more affordable housing. Again, something that should be considered. This one here, I mentioned because facilitating the provision of infrastructure. There is a state program called the Infill Infrastructure Grant Program. And that's why I basically want to encourage development standards, again, for affordable housing in particular, that meet that state funding source, because it does provide money to build infrastructure, sewer, water pump stations, roads, things of that nature in larger developments. And then pretty much lastly, one of the things that we were tasked with doing is kind of recommending sites or neighborhoods that would be conducive to affordable housing to be built. And there were several sites that were identified in the housing element. All of them were in this area between Imperial and El Segundo Boulevard and PCH. But that's not why I'm recommending them. I mean, part of the reason I'm recommending them is because that's where it's close to transit and all the amenities that are important to people. But one of the biggest reasons I'm recommending it is a lot of affordable builders use what's called the low-income housing tax credit program. It's probably the largest and most successful funding source for affordable housing in the country. And as of late, there's been an emphasis on high resource and highest resource areas in communities, and they give you an extra point on the application, which doesn't sound like a lot, but you need a perfect score almost to get the funding. And it also helps you with your tiebreaker if you do have that high score, if you are in one of those areas. And as you can see from this map, that area is in a highest resource zone. And so none of the other parts of the city are. And so from a funding perspective, besides many other reasons, this is a good area if you're trying to get the state and federal, mainly state, funding to build affordable housing. I should also point out that it includes Smoky Hollow, which is the #2 neighborhood for housing from the community survey. You know, it includes west side of PCH between Imperial and El Segundo Boulevard. It includes several of the areas, actually, four of the 5 areas that were identified as highly encouraged from the survey, the community survey. And it also talked about, like I said, access to transit and parks and all those things that are important also help with the funding applications. The downtown specific plan is currently being updated, which would include this area as well. So there's just really a kind of a coalescence of factors that make this conducive to affordable housing. Whether it's the right site or not is not for us to decide, but we just wanted you to know from a funding and all these other perspectives, it seems to be a highly desirable area to build.
Can we talk about affordable housing east of PCH?
Absolutely.
So why isn't that on the list? What is it about the land east of PCH where it's not on your map of where we should have affordable housing? Because this map is basically everything west of PCH, right?
It is, and I've been to a lot of the planning commission meetings, even when I don't always show my face. I listen to them all and the council, and I know that that's an area that is encouraged. For whatever reason, because we don't come up with the highest resource and high resource designations. That's something that's done at the state level. This is just a map of what the state designates as a highest resource area. And so east of PCH, it says there's insufficient data. Doesn't mean it necessarily won't qualify per se, but as of now, that area was not identified. I'm not 100% sure why. My assumption is, looking at the criteria that goes into it, it's an access to amenities, jobs, resources, a mix of factors that they look into. And for some reason, it did not make the list this year, but it does change. So that might be something we could work, if you have a lobbyist or with staff, to kind of work with the state to see if that area could be looked at further for future years.
So to be clear, this is just a slide showing us a designation the state has said where they would prefer high-density, low-income housing.
Correct.
Okay.
That is correct.
It doesn't prohibit us from exploring high-density, affordable housing east of PCH.
Not at all.
Okay.
Yeah, it does not at all. In the current funding environment, it'll just be harder to get those projects to be feasible, but it's definitely not impossible. So yeah, I would definitely encourage affordable housing in every community be included as a diverse portion of the city as possible. So this isn't meant to exclude any part of the city. This is just meant to kind of highlight this area is extra conducive.
Do you know how this data is collected?
There is a whole website, and I can send it to Eduardo and Paul to send to you for follow-up. But generally, they look at many things, like I said, about jobs, income levels. Typically, the state is strongly encouraging that affordable housing be built in more affluent neighborhoods, mainly because those neighborhoods have better access to high-quality schools, high-quality healthcare, high-quality jobs, and I think, as many of us know, who is in your social circle has been shown to strongly influence your economic outcomes and your life outcomes just based on many factors. And so all those things kind of go into the analysis. But I'm not an expert on it, so I'm sure there's some things. I will follow up and send you more resources.
If I may, Chair Baldino, just to address a comment you made about that preference to live or work in the city. I scanned through the development agreement just to refresh my memory. I did not see that in there. And thinking back to the negotiations process, as Alex said, there's some sort of nuance, as he said, in the law. And I think at the time of the negotiations, we felt, and the developer felt, it was sort of risky to try to put a provision in there that might sort of invite challenges or legal challenges. I think the reason why it didn't end up being in there.
Thank you for that, but I would respond with the overwhelming desire of people to have that would outweigh any potential risk the developer was concerned about. And that would have been a conversation I would have loved to have with the developer about that project, because I feel like having it now is kind of a wasted opportunity. But I'll reach out to Lionel. I'll have a conversation and see if we can't work through it. But I think that's a conversation that bears having.
As far as next steps before we open up to the kind of Q&A, basically the hope is to get your feedback, get additional community feedback, so we can kind of narrow down some semblance of a list for recommendations, then draft a affordable housing strategic plan this summer, bring it back to this commission for further review and discussion, and then hopefully back to City Council by the end of the summer. So that's kind of the overarching. There is no mandated requirements from the state. Again, this is something that I commend you that the community is doing voluntarily because you have a commitment to creating housing and opportunity in your community. So the last thing is, I'd love to hear from you. I actually was at I'm part of in Ventura County where I live. There's a housing policy leadership academy that the SCAG is doing, the Southern California Association of Governments, and this was one of the slides today in that workshop, and so I included it here just because I thought it kind of took the crux of how to increase housing production. I thought it was just kind of a nice, concise slide, so I just kind of put it up there as background.
But looking at that, I mean, what of those things does a city really have control over other than unlocking land and reducing unnecessary regulation?
Yeah, the reducing risk would be things like streamlining, and I guess that kind of coincides with reducing unnecessary regulation. Ensuring adequate capital would be things like having the affordable housing fund that you do, collecting in lieu fees, commercial linkage fees, et cetera, to encourage more development. Fostering innovation in construction technology would be something like I mentioned with regards to encouraging factory-built housing or 3D printing or other kind of innovative ideas within the municipal code, or even kind of approved floor plans that streamline development. So those are just some examples. I would say each of those were hit in some capacity in the recommendations that we reviewed tonight. But you're right. I mean, as a city, there's only so much you can do.
Okay, and then can you go back? You had the previous slide, please. Oh, no.
This one?
No, go forward to your conclusion slide.
Yeah.
Okay, the affordable housing strategic plan. What is that? That's different from our housing element we submitted, right?
It is, and so, like I mentioned, I'm not sure where the impetus for it came from, but there was a request for qualifications, back in 2020, that was kind of what we submitted under, and the idea, and correct me if I'm wrong, Eduardo or Paul, but from all the discussions I've had, the idea is basically to say, all right, what I mentioned before, the housing element's great, but is there more we can do to actually effectuate the creation of more affordable housing in our community? And so the affordable housing strategic plan was basically to take the housing element one step further, with a special emphasis on the lower income and very low income categories. Because as we know, very rarely do market rate forces produce those units, especially the very low income units. But it's basically just going to be a guidance policy document. It's not something that has to be approved by the state. It's not something that is a legal requirement. I think it helps show the state that you're serious about meeting your RENA goals. And I think that was part of the thought process behind it.
It was also my understanding that when the $5.3 million fund was created by Imperial, everyone kind of said, okay, what do we do with this? What's the best use of that? And I think many mansions and this RFP was the way to try to find that best answer.
Okay, well, thank you.
Silly.
Yeah. So what exactly are you expecting from us this evening?
No preconceived notions. It was more just to throw out some of the preliminary ideas, see if there was anything we should just absolutely stay away from, or that we should explore in more depth. And this isn't an end-all be-all, so maybe you guys had other thoughts. So really, it was just a starting point for the discussion and make sure that we were here to answer any questions, talk about what we're thinking, instead of just coming to you with a document based on something you may not want or need.
Okay.
Yeah, and Chair, as we move forward, this will be something that would be brought back to the commission. And like Alex said, we didn't want to put you in a position that, this document gets created and then it's here before you for the first time. And so, on that point, whatever ideas, frustrations even that you may have, that will definitely help us or help many mansions kind of formulate, kind of a roadmap as to how do we get to effectuating, what is called out for in the housing element. So, I think, whatever dialogue you have, we encourage even the public to come out. Unfortunately, not too many, have joined in, but I think when I last spoke with Paul, I think, we sent this out, a notice for this session to over 500 people who, that we sent notices out to. So we're trying to, get that word out and really get, the community's feel, and in this case, via you, as the commission, in terms of, what kind of direction and feedback that can really help formulate this strategy, this affordable housing strategy, as we move forward to implementing the goals and policies of housing element.
All right, discussion? Who wants to make comments?
Could I just?
Sure.
Members of the Planning Commission, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Rick Schrader. I'm president of Many Mansions. And I really don't have too much more to add than what Alex has presented. I did want to address just one specific question. You had a question on the work-live preference. And I think the concern is always fair housing. Therefore, it's not per se illegal to have a work or live or work preference. But the question is, by doing that, are you then excluding a certain demographic? So in a community like El Segundo, that is predominantly white, as was indicated in the housing element, there might be a question as to, are we restricting this housing to a specific demographic? That presumption can be overcome with different analysis and stuff, but that's always the concern about.
Okay, so let's talk about Park Vista, right? City-owned senior housing.
Right.
Would we be able to restructure that? Michelle's already saying no. I see you in my periphery over there, Caldor. Restructure that. I mean, as I understand it, it is senior housing. I assume most of the seniors don't have a lot of income. So is there something to be explored there in making that count towards these numbers, or is that an impossibility?
Yeah, I think one very easy way, I think Alex had suggested that, is simply by having it restricted through, say a refinancing through the tax-exempt bond program for affordable housing. You're restricting those units to low income. But you have a regulatory agreement now that's restricting that housing to those that are low income, and those units are now restricted. And my understanding is they could then be counted toward your affordable housing goals. As of now, I believe, what I've researched, it is for low income people, but there's no legal document from any governmental source restricting that, and that's the difference.
Okay, so we've been running low-income senior housing out of the goodness of our hearts, but because there's no federal document or state document, it doesn't count somehow.
Or even a city document. Even the city itself could restrict it. So the city itself could say...
All right, can I get a motion to...
Yeah,
just
so
well, but I'm
make
not,
some
again,
changes tonight. We're ready. Let's go.
I'm not quite sure.
was-
And it might be a wonderful opportunity, especially to refinance it, have additional money for rehab or whatever its needs, and restrict it at the same time. Again, we haven't really explored this. This isn't something.
Yeah, we have a whole senior housing
Right.
commission, so I definitely want them to weigh in or have a presentation to them first. But that's something we should absolutely explore. I mean, we've been doing it for years. It's there. It could probably use some rehabilitation and refinancing, so I would like to explore that a little bit.
So I thought the question you were going to ask is if we could restrict that to El Segundo residents. So it's my understanding that one of the maybe limiting factors is that if it was regulated we would not have that same freedom to give priority to El Segundo residents.
We can just do the live work, right?
I don't know
Why
about
is
that.
everyone so afraid of doing something that benefits the people that live here out of fear of someone who doesn't live here is going to sue us and we're all going to get in trouble? I mean, what's
But I
our
will
job? Our job is to look out for folks who live in town. And if we need low-income housing, then why aren't we trying to do that for
I
folks who
mean,
live
the
in town?
seniors aren't working in El Segundo
No,
currently.
They live in El
Maybe.
Segundo. I mean, maybe they work, maybe they're retiring.
They're retired in El
Yeah.
Segundo.
You never know.
You could make the policy, forward-looking, obviously with existing residents.
Right, we're not
exempt.
kicking any seniors out.
No.
We can lay that down right now. That's,
We can get a motion on that for sure.
yeah.
Yeah, I will
Let's-
say
let's-
that there are several jurisdictions that we've worked in that have put these in their agreements. More than a few cities. So far, it's been okay. And even in the state uniform multifamily regulations, which underlies a lot of the state-funded programs, they actually clearly state in that document that a live-work preference is acceptable to the state, at least for their funding. So there is precedent.
How many units are there at Senior
Park Vista?
At Park Vista, there's 97.
97?
Yes, yes. And just to clarify,
Very
I
low
think,
income, low income. I mean, we get like
And you could
97
get a
overnight.
massive rehab out of it. Got a lot.
yeah, and just to clarify, especially for the folks out there and the senior board, there no decisions been being made on Park Vista. I just reported to them just yesterday that we have Manny Mansions who's been assisting us with a strategy, and of course ultimately if the direction is to start looking into that, then and Sheriff Baldino hit the nail on the head is we need to start getting the senior board involved in that. But we'll see where this discussion takes us. Another thing, though, I did want to also clarify is Park Vista is affordable, and it was done in such that language, I think, to make it affordable for its seniors, and I think the intent was to really have it prioritized for those folks who live in town and want to retire in town, and so I think those nuances really didn't bode well to have this be, an official low-income affordable housing as defined by, by the state and federal government, and therefore that's why that facility does not have any deed restrictions, but it is an affordable housing.
Perhaps one thing to add for that, because we have quite a bit of experience where the funding comes from different sources, the state, tax credits, or whatever. But once the funding is in place, once the property is built, usually it's an organization like Many Mansions that has almost full operational control over that, as long as it's within the guidelines. So the nonprofit or the management company has considerable say in how it is operated. So you don't necessarily lose control just because it is now an affordable housing place.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, other comments from the dais?
I just have a couple just two quick things. So one thing that caught my eye was the $5.3 million affordable housing fund, and one of the options there was to use it for for ADUs. So if someone does theoretically tap into that money and fixes up an ADU, what's to prevent them from deciding they don't want to rent it out anymore or doing that? Is there anything that would stop it, or could someone theoretically just have government money pay for their improvements and then they walk away with a paid-for ADU? What requirements are there on a recipient there?
Yeah, you'd structure it with a restriction on the property that states the requirements of your program and that who could live there, who could qualify. It would be something that if they ever tried to sell it, would pull up on title. You would obviously want to keep we're not talking probably about a ton of units, and so it would be something that there'd be some management extra work from the staffing side where they'd have to kind of monitor those units and periodically, follow up with the owners to make sure they're meeting that obligation. But there's definitely a way to deed restrict it ensure that it stays affordable for whatever period you decide. That could be in perpetuity, that could be 55 years, that could be a shorter period. It's really up to you to decide. Different jurisdictions have done different things.
Yeah, it's usually structured, it's usually the money is given as a loan with a deed of trust.
Yeah.
But the loan doesn't have to be repaid as long as they comply with its terms. And organizations, sometimes like many mansions, would be hired to monitor that periodically, just to make sure that, in fact, it is being occupied by someone low income. And if not, they violated their loan and it could be subject to foreclosure.
So that enforcement, you know, the plan that we looked at, the resolution 2911 in January, it says at least one of, this is inclusionary units, at least one of the units in each 2-unit residential development, or at least one unit on any lot created pursuant to an urban lot split, must be constructed and offered for sale or for rent as moderate, low, or low income unit restricted for occupancy by a moderate, low, or low income household. So how do you, I mean, if that's potentially every lot, how is that enforced? How does the city really, or the state know that's actually being enforced?
That's for SB 9 when they subdivide. So when you got your permit, there would be a deed restriction on that house, and then many mansions would know, okay, we've got another affordable unit, and they'd have to monitor that periodically to make sure they're not in violation of their deed restriction, I believe.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. That's probably an enormous task to do, but.
Oh, yeah, the staff can't do it, for sure.
Okay.
If someone were to sell that property, the obligations could potentially go to the next owner if there's a deed restriction? Wow, okay.
They would, they absolutely would.
Interesting, okay. Thank you.
I have a question about segmentation, and when the state comes up with our RENA numbers, are they looking at household types, or is it just simply household income, and that could be a single person or it can be a family of 5? And the reason I ask is, for example, Pacific Coast Common had a high percentage of the single units,
right.
And I just wondered how that was determined. You know, how do you know that X percent ought to be for single occupancy when maybe there's a much bigger need for families? And,
Well, that's an interesting nuance, is you don't get more credit for a 3-bedroom than you do for a studio. It's based on unit count, not household size or unit size. So not sure why that's the case, but that is the case. And so, yeah, it's just based on total unit count by income.
Yeah, so I guess the question, obviously, it's easier to develop a bunch of smaller units, but does that really satisfy market demand if there's a lot more families out there that need assistance?
Well, you'll notice in Pacific Coast Commons, they originally wanted even smaller units than they got, but staff worked on the negotiations to get larger units and a more diversity of units. But even then, you'll see that only a few of the units are for 2 bedrooms. Most of the units are for 1 bedrooms and smaller because of that, for that same reason.
The other thing, it's nice thing about affordable housing that is restricted, we pay particular attention so that the units are not over-occupied.
Yeah.
That is, they have the right number of persons per household per bedroom. So if they're not overcrowded. Mm-hmm. But to your question, I think the state feels, I think generally it's that we can build more units if they're 1 bedrooms or smaller units. And also, I think demographically, the household sizes, the average household size is decreasing. I mean, our experience is that our 1 bedroom and 2 bedroom units, absolutely no problem leasing. 3 bedroom units are sometimes a challenge. There just isn't as many bigger families anymore.
Right.
So.
What is the sweet spot for your apartment units or developments that you guys built? I saw you said some had 25, some had 50 units. What's the right?
I think, as Alex mentioned, 50 units is a very good size. That allows a lot of the amenities in there. we could have one manager there, we can have a active service program in there. It's generally lower density, it doesn't create all the parking and traffic issues that communities are often concerned about. 50 units is probably a good size, but the bigger that you do, the more efficient, the less cost per unit. So that does seem to be the trend.
How big of an acreage do you need for those 50 units?
In general, often the jurisdictions that we're working in, it's 30 units per acre. But in other areas, it's much higher. It depends on the parking that's going to be required, and it depends on the unit size and who's going to be living there.
Right. Yeah. And Commissioner, I just wanted to mention regarding the Pacific Coast Commons project. During the negotiations, the applicant, I believe, initially proposed no 2 bedrooms to be affordable, and the agreement itself, as approved, contains 3 2-bedroom units out of the 32.
Great, thanks for pushing for that.
And I think, Jay, that kind of highlights, too, the difference between a developer with an inclusionary housing ordinance or through negotiation providing affordable housing, and then a true nonprofit or even for-profit affordable housing developer identifying a site, right? Because if you were to look at something and need it to get approved for tax credits, there would be some unit mix that you were dictated to score points. So that negotiation doesn't happen to that same.
Yeah, right.
There's not that control over it. And kind of on that note, I know Alex noted a handful of sites that you felt were the most developable, but my pet peeve site wasn't on there. So I'm curious to pick your brain, that Stickenstein vacant property on PCH, that every time I used to pick up Vinnie Baldino at practice, I would drive right by on Palm. Is that a developable site for affordable housing, in your expert opinion?
I will have to get back to you on that. I will research a little bit more. I didn't, obviously we weren't able to go through the full breadth of every site in the community. We mainly focused on the housing element sites as identified. And then we wanted to see more from this type of community meeting, like, hey, where is housing being encouraged? Like if we came back and you're like, hey, we just don't want housing in this part of our community, then obviously we didn't want to spend too much time doing that. So I will do some more research, and I'll follow up either with you directly or through staff.
May I ask, why do you think that's a good site for affordable housing?
Well, it needs to be something.
Yeah.
I think it's been vacant for maybe a decade, and it's an acre.
Mm-hmm.
It's across the street from Pacific Coast Commons.
Right.
Got it.
So we have now we have a precedent for density there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think another site that you identified was that Bank of America site, which, also small building, huge parking lot, that makes sense, and the Travel Lodge, which makes sense. And it's kind of in line with those other properties.
Well, I will say, and I mentioned that in my slide, and the reason I use Pacific Coast Commons as a case study is it includes the elements that are really necessary for feasible projects. The height, the density, all those things is, in my personal, my professional opinion, the housing element sites as upzoned, even though they're going to be upzoned, are still insufficient, to really have a feasible project. But it is a great start, and I'm glad that project got approved, because it does show what it really takes, given high construction costs, high land costs, limited sites and availability, limited funding and resources. Those are, density, height, all those things play an important factor. But I will look at Stickenstein.
If I may add one more thing, Commissioner, I believe the Stickenstein site was in escrow very recently to be purchased by a developer who was interested in a development similar to the Pacific Coast Commons development.
Not the hotel anymore.
No.
And I just had a quick question then. If East of Sepulveda, there's no data available for you to have done some research and development, and it's a resounding first area from the community input to develop, how, how does that get talked about and how does that get looked at east of Sepulveda?
In my opinion, the best opportunity would be through inclusionary requirements or development agreements, however you end up doing it. Mainly because at the moment, and this may change in a couple years, the primary funding source that someone like our organization would use, it's just not going to be very competitive. And so if you were to say, hey, we have this great site east of PCH, we'd love you to come in and build it. I mean, we'd try, but it would be very difficult. And I'm not confident we'd be able to get the competitive state funding necessary for it to be feasible. So that's probably where I do it, through ADUs, through inclusionary, until kind of that funding source at the state is oversubscribed right now, but that's not always been the case.
So because there are no parks and other amenities east of PCH, the state does not think they're feasible, you can't get the funding, so you really can't have a project that's going to be developed over there with state funding.
Yes, that's accurate, yes.
So does that mean market rate needs to lead that discussion?
Well, even if you have market rate, where are the parks? You know, you got Ralph's, and then what else do you have over there?
A lacrosse field.
Yeah, currently we're a rugby field. But that leads to the other question. I mean, the reason there haven't been 40-unit apartments built in this town is because there's no area to build them. And even if you could have an apartment building charging market rate to be very profitable, where's it going to go? So how are we supposed to sit here and say, yeah, we're going to have all these great high-density housing in a 1 square mile radius where there's no land to develop? I mean, I don't want to sound cynical, but I feel like we're making these plans that, you know, how are we going to get 400 units within 1 square mile when we don't own any land? And with the respect to using the Civic Center, you know, I sit here and I look at everyone enjoying farmers market and skateboarding, and it's like, why would we destroy a focal point of our city, you know, because the state wants us to have more housing? Where are the solutions of where we're going to get 400 units in the next 10 years? Because I've been through a lot of these meetings and I don't wrap my head around how this is feasibly going to pan out. We've got Pacific Coast Commons, great. We might have one other large high-density housing unit, and then we're done. Like, I can't think of another piece of land that is going to be a viable solution, especially if we can't go east of PCH. We're already on top of each other here. So what's the solution?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the church site that was identified in the site inventory, again, privately owned, would be a great site. Again, don't know if they're interested or they're not interested. But again, usually faith-based organizations have land that's underutilized for a variety of reasons and are conducive to or open to affordable housing because it kind of meets the spirit of their faith and their mission. So that's probably one of the better sites, but it's going to be a challenge. I don't want to sit here and sugarcoat it and say, hey, if you do these things, you're going to get it. Because I will say, also from my professional opinion, I've never seen a city meet their RENA goals, especially for the very low income units. I've never seen it. I'm sure it's happened some point, but I've never seen it. But I think the efforts that we're talking about today are to make a good faith effort to move in that direction within a way that the city is comfortable. And if let's just say if even 5 more affordable units were created because of the work that we're doing here tonight and through this process, that's 5 families in need who are getting that housing. So that's the way I choose to look at it, is what is the positive outcomes of the work we do, knowing that it's hard and that, you know, there's always going to be someone in need. But I think that's kind of the goal, is can we create a few more than we would have otherwise, at least.
Let me ask Rand's question kind of a different way. The strategic plan is great, and I think it's important to kind of go through these different options. Is there a point where Many Mansions makes a recommendation as to what to do with the $5.3 million fund?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of did in the PowerPoint, but I'll be honest, it was generic because we didn't want to box you into anything. That's why I threw in the MHR program, because does it create new units? No, but at least it does something good for the residents. The idea of kind of buying down some units in new projects, like I said, you know, obviously we didn't have this plan in place. You know, I'd have loved to maybe buy some more units at Pacific Coast Commons or a development like that with that money to go from 32 to 42 or whatever. You know, those are kind of things that I see as the lowest hanging fruit. In an ideal world, I would love for there to be a site where some entity like ours found a site and built a 50-unit project, and the city contributed that money to it, and we get, you know, we leverage that 5-to-1, and we build 50 units of affordable housing with great on-site services and strong management, and that's a good chunk of the way. We don't have that site yet, and we're reluctant to kind of, in a meeting like this, say this is the right site without feedback, right? And I'm not sure there is a perfect site, but like I said, the church site is a good one. Other sites are I think open to it, but I'm always remiss in a public meeting to kind of say this is the perfect site without feedback.
Yeah, I get that. I just wonder, is there any point in this relationship between many mansions in the city where you guys actually make a solid recommendation for how that money should be spent?
Yeah, I think what we would do is outline some of the best options and why this option is better than that. Mm-hmm. So maybe the worst option is to use that money and buy a half-acre site. The best option, the biggest bang for your buck, would be to do this or that, and these would be the middle ones. So yes, I think that would be I think that's the essence of the strategic plan. You know, all these different things in the housing element, let's prioritize some of them, and let's do some analysis as to what might occur and why these are better to focus on now, and why these probably could wait, or these probably aren't very viable at all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Question for staff then on that note. I think Michael answered this question last time, but this will go to city council before the summer, before they're voting on anything. And part of the conversation is with the inclusionary housing ordinance, right? So we had a conversation, staff was halfway on a path, on a direction, and then it got to council, and then that shifted entirely. I would hate to see that happen. This is super comprehensive. You all did an amazing job, and I would hate for it to be derailed and pushed into some completely unintended or, you know, unforeseen direction. Will council have an opportunity to look at it?
The affordable housing strategy, of course.
Before, I guess it gets
to council
further
for
worked,
approval.
and
I
then,
see.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we'll make every effort to keep the council informed of our progress and perhaps do a similar study session.
So my 2 cents on the 5.3 million are that money is best served creating new units. The conversation about, you know, we can help fund ADUs or home improvements, I would not like to see that, because you'll dwindle that 5.3. And I don't think there's any property owner in town who can't refinance their home and pull money out to rehabilitate. You know, maybe I'm wrong, but property values here have skyrocketed and refinance is always available. But I don't see how that helps us tick off numbers by improving older homes for low income, because we're not adding any units in that calculation.
Yeah, that was my take of that same deal.
I mean, it'd be nice if the city wanted to redesign my house, but it's not gonna.
It doesn't turn it into an affordable
No, it doesn't.
dwelling.
Yeah. But again, I'm at a loss of where 50 units is gonna go in the city. And if we don't have 50 units, you know, the ADUs are only gonna get us so far.
We talked a lot about live work in Smoky Hollow, and we were asked to set it aside.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's probably not gonna get us 200 units, but I do think that there are great types of businesses out there. You know, a photographer studio guy who wants to live up above, you know, his studio or her studio.
I think we have some of those.
Oh, they're caretaker units.
Yeah.
It's a ruse, you know? Well, and I think that,
Something like
yeah,
that,
and we talked about that with staff, and at the time, staff said, "Oh, no, this isn't the right time to talk about it. Let's get this specific plan through, and then we'll come back and talk about residential options and opportunities in Smoky Hollow. And I don't think that conversation has ever happened in a meaningful way.
No, I would agree. And I want to say, correct me if I'm wrong, the Smoky Hollow development project, they wanted some penthouse type housing on that project, right?
That's correct, yes.
And staff said, no, you really can't do that because of the Smoky Hollow plan, or it wasn't really a caretaker unit?
No, the primary, or the crux of that was, they were proposing it on the very top level, which would have increased the height of that building even more than.
Beyond
what
the
was approved.
elevator
Yes.
shaft?
Yes.
Okay.
But yeah, they originally had, 4 caretaker units there, which, we tried to, have them redesign it to perhaps be within the building envelope. But, they wanted to just pursue with what they presented to you.
Okay, what steps would we need to take to have a discussion about live work in Smoky Hollow?
Yeah, I think we could come back with an agendized item for that. I will say though that at the moment we are looking at perhaps looking at an overhaul of the specific plan. There are a couple things that we want to just clean up, and I know that back in 2018 when we were originally trying to get the specific plan through, that may have been at that point may have been mum's the word, don't talk about housing, but being in this state that we're in now, seeing that there might be some appetite, to consider it, and knowing that, live work, we'd have to explore that with legal counsel, but, that definitely might be a path. So, anyhow, all that to say, we are kind of working on perhaps coming back to the commission, with kind of like an overhaul of the specific plan, Smoky Hollow specific plan. And so I'll circle back with our director and see about agendizing a more formal item with respect to that, and getting some clear direction from the commission to include that as part of the endeavor.
Yeah, and live work is great, but why not look at mixed use as well? I mean, if the idea is to activate Smoky Hollow, I mean, we've seen the complete street renderings. We've seen all the vision that's supposed to create a really vibrant quadrant of El Segundo. If that only happens at lunchtime, that's kind of half the story. Being able to have people that live there and people are always walking the streets and in the evening in restaurants, and you live upstairs from the restaurant, that's kind of a cool environment. So I'd like to see a lot of that sort of thing explored.
Yeah, no doubt, and yeah, we could definitely do that and bring that to commission, and I think there might be other opportunities to explore additional housing for example, the downtown specific plan is currently, just getting started right now, the whole revamp of that, so that may be another opportunity area to perhaps explore that, to allow for more housing and perhaps higher density. There are some good examples currently, one across the street from here that is a perfect, candidate or example of live work, and even if it's not truly live work, the fact of the matter is, providing more housing, within the downtown area, it only spurs, better, bodes better for the businesses there, because, now you're increasing the, your market for each of these businesses. So it could be a win-win, but yeah, that's definitely something that could also be explored within the context of the downtown specific plan.
Yeah, and Ryan, I know you're concerned about, where are the people going to skateboard and walk, but really, I would say our farmers market is often a little sad. And I want this farmers market to be awesome. I want parks or, concerts here in the plaza. I want more kids skateboarding here. And having a little bit of density here, I think would help everybody, help all the restaurants, help all the businesses, help farmers, help the guys selling the guava juice there. So.
No, I don't disagree, but our downtown plan already allows for housing on top, right?
Not at a density that really is conducive to housing. You're gonna have somebody who owns that property, maybe build their home above it, but
Well,
you're
look
not
at,
gonna get a developer to build housing that way.
Next to the Starbucks on Grand, right? Those are apartments on top of of those retails,
Mm-hmm.
right? Those
On
are,
on top of the Starbucks.
yeah, yeah. That's what I'm saying, when I put apartments on
4
top of them.
apartments.
Right,
Yeah.
but I mean, even, the thing is, yeah, okay, we make this great plan, but logistically, someone's gonna have to either knock something down and build new, which no one's gonna do, or build on top of, which is probably gonna be cost prohibitive anyway.
Well, there is and I was gonna ask, because you talked, the Civic Center, Civic Plaza, I mean, there was a whole RFP, RFQ.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Do we know where that
Yep.
is? I mean, many developers submitted some sort of plan. 10?
Yeah, they were in the notes, actually, funnily enough.
And then,
10
I don't-
responses received.
did that go anywhere? Are we having meetings? Is somebody having meetings with developers to pick a plan to move forward?
You know, I'd like to give you a good answer to that, but I don't know. You know, with that kind of, you know, with some of the staff turnover and with not only at just regular staff, but at the executive level, you know, we can look into it and, you know, but it's honestly, it's kind of been taken out of planning's court. It's more in admin, but I can at least try to find out what I can and report back to the commission on that.
What do you mean by admin?
Oh, in terms of city management, in terms of any kind of negotiations that were to have been going on, you know, we're not privy to that, and at least at this point, so.
Scott took it with him.
So the inclusionary housing element, would that be some type of code that, you know, developer wants to build 50 units that says you have to have X number of affordable? Is that what that is?
Correct.
Correct.
Okay, would that only apply to larger developments, or would that apply to everything in R1 or R2 or R3?
We could fashion the policy however the city wants, you know, to address our particular needs. There's a wide variety of tools there with an inclusionary housing policy.
Okay, my 2 cents on that then. SB 9, we've already got a mandate for low income. And then for any unit over 50, I think having an inclusionary plan lessens our ability to negotiate development agreements, right? If we're gonna have a housing development come in, we're gonna wanna negotiate 2 bedrooms, you know, whatever it is. If we set something in a plan to appease the people in Sacramento, we're kind of tying our hands behind our backs of what we can actually ask for when a project does come upon the horizon. So I know it's great to check a box and say we've got this inclusionary plan for when this thing happens, but I think the development agreements need to be on a case-by-case basis so that we can really determine, you know, the effects of that neighborhood, those neighbors, and what we need. So I wouldn't be in favor of any overreaching inclusionary plan for large developments in El Segundo. But that's just me. I don't have a consensus on that.
No, I asked you that same question a couple months ago, and I appreciated your answer. You said, you know, why leave the money on the table if we don't have to? And my question was, are we preventing some developers from approaching us if they think the limit is X? And, you know, clearly the Pacific Coast Commons people convinced us that they can come in and ask for more if that's appropriate, if that's what they want to do.
Yeah.
Could I comment on that?
Sure.
Because I think one of the things that Alex stressed is the risk involved in development. And for a developer, you have to pay many hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars before you even get to the planning commission or the city council. If you had an inclusionary housing policy, whatever it is, reasonable, they would only start the project knowing that going in. And they would already be factored into their price and their cost and their development budget. At that point, you can be negotiating on other things. You don't have to spend, you know, months and months negotiating how many affordable units, because they already know that, and you can focus your attention on negotiating parking or off-site improvements or unit size or all these other types of things. If you don't have that, there's a lot more risk, and I think you do lose some potential developers that might want to start a project, just simply because when it's all said and done, they don't know what's going to be required of them.
I see your point, but I also don't think there's a developer in housing who doesn't know a city's gonna ask for affordable units. What that number is, I don't know. We don't know until we see it. But again, I don't like the idea of us just kind of putting this cookie cutter thing out there for any development, because it does inhibit us. And I agree. I spoke to a developer today at lunch who said, we don't know what the city wants, and we don't know who to ask at the city for what the city wants. And that's our problem, right? And I've seen that over the years on how these development agreements are slapped together and torn apart and put back together. And that's something that, you know, we can work on, but I think that's a fundamental issue the city has to address, especially dealing with larger development agreements in housing, is how does the city negotiate that, and how is that done in such a way to where it's at least transparent and there's community input on that. So I get your point. I appreciate your expertise on that. I don't see it as a risk, because we're gonna ask for affordable housing for any development. They know that, and then that kind of begins that negotiation.
Well, the Pacific Coast Commons is probably a good blueprint or a template. So everybody knows now that, okay, you know, probably gonna go into it with 12% of the units are gonna have to be affordable, and we can start with there for negotiations.
The good news is the nepotism of developer runs very deep in this town. So the folks who are thinking about the next big project are very much aware of what happened with Pacific Coast Commons.
Yeah, and Chair, just from my experience throughout my career, you know, I've worked with other cities that have affordable housing, inclusionary housing requirements, even as little as, you know, where you have a project that is 5 or more dwelling units, you know, that's subject to inclusionary housing. But then the other component to that is, you know, if you know, take that example where you have five units. Well, if you're gonna require that at least 1 or 2 of them be made affordable, then it's not gonna yield any kind of profit or any kind of, you know, on part of the developer. So then the other component would be like an in lieu fee, where instead of providing the actual units, that you also have an in lieu fee that they could pay instead of providing those, and then that could also be used to augment the $5.5 million that we have, and continue to put money in that bucket. So, you know, all that to say, I just want to let you know, I mean, it could be like more of a multi-pronged approach where you have an inclusionary housing ordinance, but at the same time have the ability for an in lieu payment, and of course with density bonuses, all these things might, you know, can be used simultaneously to really, you know, beef up the number of units, and then if the number of units can't be provided, then there's a mechanism to provide for an in lieu fee payment to put money in that account.
We have a percent for arts program here, which is a wonderful thing. You know, should there also be a consideration for a percent for humanity, you know?
If I may make a suggestion too, one thing you may want to consider, and I kind of mentioned in the presentation, would be more of a inclusionary housing guideline, where you still have the ability to negotiate a project-specific development agreement, but at least it sets kind of some of the framework on what the city's thinking, and it includes things. I know there was some discussion in the city council meeting on how was the development agreement negotiated for Pacific Coast Commons, and if you guys come up with a guideline, at least sets a base of, hey, I want to live work preference. Hey, I prefer more very low income units. I prefer larger units. You know, you can put in some of those things that are important to you, but not necessarily mandated, and that gives the developer some level of certainty and staff some level of direction as they're negotiating these agreements.
Yeah, I wouldn't be opposed for a guideline as kind of an outline of what the community expects in return, because then we can include that work-live preference in there as well. But that's something worth exploring. I appreciate that. Okay, any other comments or direction or thoughts? What are we going to do about east of PCH, Brenda?
Exactly. What are we going to do? We had a great explanation that it just isn't fiscally feasible to develop.
Well, no, he says you can't get this leverage of $5 to $1 because the state says that's not a good place for it. But if we have this kind of guideline, if someone wanted to build an apartment complex or something, then we could say, oh, okay, well, if you want to do that east of PCH, which is not zoned to do now, so no one would ever have that idea, then we could probably negotiate. I think what they're saying is if you really want to have mini mansions find like an acre and build something, we're not going to be able to do it with $5 million. And we're not going to get any state funding for it, so it's not on his map of, you know, everyone in the R1 zone is great according to the state.
No, it's a zoning issue.
Yeah,
gotta be.
I mean, it's not zoned for anything other than, you know, commercial, and there's a lot of good reasons why we need commercial on that side to pay for everything we do on this side of PCH. So I'm asking you because I don't know what the answer is, but.
Right.
Well,
Do you do a specific plan for that area that has mixed use?
we tell our friends who just built Pacific Coast Commons that there's some indication that we might be open to residential east of PCH. And we'll have a proposal for a plan for a project east of PCH.
Yeah, and good community developers know how to create community and add open space and add amenities that, you know, the east of PCH is lacking right now. And so there are ways to do that and create livable places that actually have great value and have amenities that
Yeah, I mean, it was a resounding 25.6% of the people.
Except I take a little caveat to that because the question was, where would you like
that was
affordable
NIMBYism.
housing?
That
And
was
they said,
NIMBYism.
as far away from me as possible.
Exactly.
Where nobody lives.
Yep.
I mean, that's how that question was posed and how they answered it.
I agree. But if we're open to it, I mean, if that's the mechanism, if that helps the conversation, then that's okay.
I agree.
It should be a conversation that happens. I mean, we're all obviously struggling. Where, west of Sepulveda, PCH, sorry, do you put more housing?
I mean, I have lots of ideas on where, but you don't have necessarily willing landowners who are interested in making that a reality.
Right.
Yeah, well,
But I think, to get back to what was said, our job here is just to try to put forth regulations and processes where we can show the state we're trying, right? Because I honestly believe there's no way we're building 500 more housing units in 10 years. There's just not enough area. There's no place to put them, right?
I bet we'll get a lot of market rate units in the next 10 years. We will not get affordable units, but we will get another 200 market rate units.
You mean like single family or
No, like apartments.
east of PCH?
West of PCH.
Oh, okay, you're still talking about,
Oh, yeah.
okay.
And maybe east of I mean, because I think it's a different, I don't know, it's a different demographic. In reality, people who are gonna live east of PCH are probably not looking for schools and parks. I mean, it's to supply that workforce that's east of PCH. You are young and, you know, you're an engineer at Raytheon. You're not taking your kid to the park at Raytheon.
Right. Wait, there's a park at Raytheon?
You're not allowed to access it.
I'm sorry.
There
That's
is.
right, exactly right.
It's just not a
They're gonna
public
hop
park.
the fence.
We don't own the land, but, you know, whatever. No big whoop. Just acreage gone. Okay, so any closing comments or thoughts? Or should we just continue to ramble up here? I'm fine either way. I haven't seen you guys in a long time. Nice to see you, Kevin. I haven't seen you in forever.
It's an important conversation, you know?
Yeah, I think we need to brainstorm on how we get folks in town involved. Like maybe next time we do our planning commission meeting outside
That's a good
in the
idea.
farmer's market and be
There you
like, we're
go.
talking about housing. Guys, come on, we've got balloons, you know, whatever it takes. Whatever it takes, because I know what you guys think. It's just an echo chamber at this point.
So true.
No, well, yeah, you're right, yeah.
I'm being halfway serious.
You're being completely serious.
Well, there was the one slide that summarizes why we need affordable housing, to me, is what gets promoted everywhere. It's my favorite slide in the whole presentation. That 40% of our residents qualify, you know, below moderate income and 25% at low income. That is, nobody will believe that. And we'll point them to Alex to give them the data. And that needs to be just posted everywhere that it can be.
It's powerful. And if I may too, I think to take Chair Baldino's comment about taking it out there to the farmers market, we actually in our planning and our development services department within the next month, we're making plans to start taking our department out there and having a booth, a table out there with some informational handouts. So this could be definitely one way to at least take it out to the people instead of just having it on a static website or something like that. Again, I mean, we're trying to do what we can as well. Like I indicated earlier, just for this meeting, I mean, we sent out a couple emails with over 500 recipients on it and did what we can. But that's only part of the equation. So under Michael's leadership, that is one thing that he has wanted to do was take this type of take our department out there, be more exposed to the public. So yeah, I just want to let you know that starting in a couple months we'll be having our own booth out there once a month, but at least that's the way it'll start, and we'll have some staff members out there throughout the evening and providing informational handouts and whatever we can provide, whether it be the SB9 stuff, information sheets on transitional or supportive housing or micro units. We can do that, and that the slide that Commissioner Keldorf likes, we'll definitely put that together as something that as a brochure type thing that we can put out there. So yeah, so we'll be out there to at least take planning out to the streets.
Well, whatever you can do to encourage more public participation is great. But you better bring your A game, because the Parks and Rec kids out there, they're killing it. They got music going. They're on top of it every week.
Maybe we need the Parks and Rec.
There you
Rec
go.
kids
They're the ones that need to present
get the
it.
message to the people.
All right. Well, thank you, staff, and thank you. It's nice to have many mansions on our team to help answer these with sometimes maybe dumb questions from us to try to figure out how to put this puzzle together. And I really want to encourage having more of these open sessions, and I'll try to drag people here. I did get your email to join as a member of the public, so thanks for setting that out. But this only works if we get more stakeholders involved. So thank you everyone for your hard work this evening on this. It was an important discussion to have.
Thank you.
Okay, that brings us next to agenda item J, report from our Director of Development or designee. That would be you, Eduardo.
No, you allowed me to make my little presentation of our new staff member earlier, so I appreciate that. But no, there's nothing else to report on.
Okay, thank you. Report from City Attorney's Office?
Nothing at this time, thank you.
Thank you, Joaquin. Planning Commissioner comments. Any comments?
Thanks again to Many Mansions. That was very thorough.
All right, well, that brings us to adjournment. Our next meeting is April 14th at 5:30 in Council Chambers. Thank you, everyone.